idea for Lethal Ties first originated in 2015 from stories in the news about child abuse, mainly by powerful people. I mean, there was Jimmy Savile, TV celebrity, huge, popular guy, and there were cover-ups, children not being believed. Quite shocking, really. But the one story that caught my eye was a series of alarming allegations about a VIP paedophile ring in Westminster. These stories were in the papers in 2015, and I've referred to them in my book. Now, those stories turned out to be false, but no one can deny at the time they were quite plausible, even the police. Now, the exposure of institutional child abuse is actually nothing new. It's been going on for decades, and it's been exposed in religious institutions such as the church. It also happens in schools. It happens in care homes, such as the Rotherham scandal. And more recently, it's actually been exposed with football coaches. Did anyone see the BBC documentary Football's Darkest Secret? You saw that, did you? Yeah, it was horrific, wasn't it? But it's not just the nature of the abuse that sickens me, but the psychologically damaging effect on the victims, and my story concentrates on the victims. I'm just going to read an extract from a review I had on, this is actually on Amazon, but this reviewer wrote, "The plot is expertly handled and its breadth is truly impressive, ranging from the most vulnerable of society's rejects to its highest echelons." I actually think that sums it up quite well. So that's where the idea sprung from, which sounds pretty grim, but I wanted to write a thriller that tackles this subject, but portrayed through the minds of the victims. So what is Lethal Ties about? I've explained where I got the idea from, but simply put, 3 friends meet in a children's home, and one of them disappears. Maisie and Joe have never discovered what happened to their friend Sam, and it's left them traumatised. But the pivotal scene in Lethal Ties is when these 2 characters cross paths 20 years later, and they are 2 very different people. So I'm going to throw a question to the audience now. How many people are in their 30s?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm really glad, because I sort of looking around, I sense we're sort of more of a middle-aged group. In their 30s. I mean, 40s? That'll do. How many people in their 40s here? Right, a couple in their 40s. So mostly we're a bit older than the characters in my book. But I want you to think about when you were at lower school, when you were, say, 11 or 12 years of age, and maybe try and remember somebody who you knew at school who had an impact, and say you saw them again now. Would you recognise them? Sometimes. If it was someone like a best friend or a worst enemy, someone who really was memorable.
Somebody who stood up for some reason.
Yeah, okay, that's great, because this is what Lethal Ties is about. The word ties actually refers to friendship. 2 very troubled youngsters I should say, not youths, who are bound by friendship, yet they're prepared to face the worst to find out what happened to the missing member of their gang. But their reunion, it sort of sparks danger, which is where the lethal comes from. Lethal ties, lethal refers to this danger. Because there is a mystery at the heart of this story, and believe me, their enemies do not want them finding out what happened to the missing member of their gang. And this becomes more apparent when Maisie helps Joe turn his life around. Maisie's my female lead. She's the first character you'll meet in my book. And in the modern day setting, Maisie, 32 years old, is an independent professional woman. She works for West Sussex County Council in the childcare and fostering department, and she was fostered herself. This happened after the care home incident. She was very lucky. She was brought up by very kind, caring guardians. But in her teens, she started having these recurring nightmares, and she developed a phobia of forests. She suffers from panic attacks, but the one thing that's really holding her back in life is her difficulty in forming relationships. a fear of intimacy. And yeah, she's a very troubled young woman, deeply troubled, and this leads her towards therapy. Obviously, as you all know, there are many people in this world who have emotional hang-ups. And we need to understand why, you know, I mean, what has gone wrong in their lives? You know, one way of resolving this, I've discovered, is drawing out memories which may have been repressed, such as a childhood trauma. Because memory, I mean, it's a very strange thing, the memory. From the day we're born, all through our lives, everything that happens to us is stored somewhere in here. Now, obviously, when we're very young, early childhood memories are very difficult to recall. But the older we get, the more we remember, and also the more memories get filtered out. So, for example, if you went on a training course, you're far more likely to hold that information in your memory because it might be directly related to your work. But say you're trying to remember which actor played a certain part in a film and you just cannot call it to mind. Well, the reason for that is because it's just not so relevant to you. It's not as important. It's not an important memory in your life. And then you get these other memories which are sort of buried deep down. And this is the subconscious mind's way of protecting you in your conscious state. But they do manifest themselves in other ways, such as phobias, such as nightmares, which is exactly what happens in Maisie's case. I've actually had psychotherapy myself. I'll tell you, it was when I started a new job in Worthing, and I was living in this new town. I didn't know anyone, and I was finding it really difficult to make friends. You know, I was having a hard time. And I just didn't seem to have the confidence to sort of go out and meet people. I was very shy, and that was holding me back. It was making me miserable because I was lonely. So I actually went to a psychotherapist, and sure enough, it's amazing what you can remember when you're under a mild hypnotic trance. I mean, things came back to me from my childhood, things I hadn't thought about in years. And it did help, because it sort of helped in a way, because it helped me to understand a little bit more about myself. But that's all I'm going to say about the subject of psychotherapy. I mean, professional help is out there at the moment. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of talking therapy, and there's a lot of the type of therapy Maisie has, which is aggressive therapy. A lot of it is actually mentioned in this book. I've included a few of her therapy sessions, because parts of the story are actually told through her memories. Just little scraps of information from their clues to something that happened in this children's home. So I'm now going to talk about my next main character, which is Joe. And I do like Joe, actually. He's a bit rough, he's a bit of a hottie. I actually will say that something else that inspired this story was when I met this group of homeless men along Bognor seafront. Now, some of you might have heard this story already, because I did sort of mention it when I was on the BBC Radio Sussex a few weeks ago. Does anyone here from Bognor? Yeah? Do you remember them?
Yes.
It was at beach shelter opposite the Waverley pub.
Yes.
Two old fellas
Yes.
with snowy white hair and snowy beards,
Yes.
and they were there for about 2 or 3 months. And I got to know them quite well, actually, because it was a freezing cold winter and I felt really sorry for them. But on 1 or 2 occasions, I noticed a younger man in the shelter, and he seemed very withdrawn. He sat at the back in the shadows, he didn't say very much, kept his head down, wouldn't even meet my eye. And I just thought, it occurred to me a time, he looked vulnerable, he looked haunted. And it got me thinking about Joe. Or in particular, a scene where Maisie's thinking about him too. Because ever since starting therapy, she starts to get flashbacks about this children's home. And Joe features in these memories. What she remembers about Joe is that he was a very tough character. But not only did he suffer abuse, but the manager of the home, Mr. Mortimer, who's the evil dude in this story, really hated him and was cruel to him. And she remembers how scared he was. So all this is flashing through her mind. She's walking along the promenade in Bognor. She's exhausted, she's anxious, she's having these awful recurring nightmares. And she's also started to imagine seeing Sam again, the boy who disappeared. So her head's in a very, very strange place at this point in time. And then she bumps into Joe, finds him homeless in this beach shelter. And the first thing she wants to do is help him turn his life around. So imagine the scene. 20 years have passed since these characters saw each other, have seen each other, and they've got a sense of unfinished business. Now, Joe was always meant to be the tougher, more streetwise character. And the reason for this is, whereas Maisie's professional, she's got a job and a flat, Joe has fallen on hard times. He's actually served time in prison, got into drugs. He's ended up in one of these halfway houses full of other broken men in society, and he's ultimately ended up homeless. Which brings me back to this pivotal scene in Lethal Ties. And at this point, I'm going to give a short reading. It's like the day she finds Joe, and later on that evening, when they have a meal together in her flat, it's the start of a discussion where they share memories. So I'm going to have to jump in halfway through this scene because there's quite a lot of build-up to it. But she's trying to get Joe talking, and it's like trying to get blood out of a stone. The room seemed to darken all around us. The atmosphere strained. Try me, I pressed. It might help me to understand some of the stuff that's coming out in my therapy. Mortimer really hated you, didn't he? Joe shrugged, but he was no longer looking at me. I knew stuff, had my own idea how them homes were being run. Violent places at the best of times, kids being attacked, and a lot of them were almost feral. Truth is, Maisie, you're either a victim or a fighter. And I hate to say it, but you were one of the victims, and so was Sam. Sam, I gasped. You do remember him? His eyes slid shiftily towards mine. That he disappeared, how could I forget? Do you ever wonder what happened to him? Yeah, Joe said. 20 years might be a long time, but I always had a hunch. Should have kept it to myself, because Mortimer had it in for me. I was suspicious of a lot of things, but pestering about Sam really got his blood up. So what went on after I left? He turned his glass in his hands. I never imagined things could get worse, but they did. All I ever wanted to know was where Sam had gone, but Mortimer started threatening me. His head lifted. The glow of a light bulb reflected in his angry eyes. If he'd followed it through, I'd be dead by now. I frowned and picked up my own glass. A lump of fear rose in my throat, but I gulped the feeling down. You seriously think he was planning to kill you? Yeah, I was trouble. A piece of scum, he called me. And he promised me that one day he'd deal with me once and for all. And I thought, fuck this, I ain't sticking around here. And that's why I escaped. Gazing at him now, I wondered what he was trying to hide from me. I was still no nearer to understanding his reason for locking me in the laundry room, nor the secrets he harboured about Sam's disappearance. Go on, I pressed him. You ran away from the home, but you ended up on the streets. What happened in the years between? I was coming to that, he said, a smile playing on his lips. Would you mind if I grab a smoke first? I'll go outside. Go on then, I consented, but don't be long. Joe kept his head down. Stealing a glance down the avenue, he made a mental note of the cars in the neighbourhood. The little silver Toyota was Maisie's, but a shiny white Nissan loomed behind it. Not just any car, some huge, great big bastard of a car with tinted windows covering almost half the pavement. With little room to circumnavigate, he didn't pay much attention to the next car in the row. Black as death, it blended into the shadows, just inches out of range of the nearest lamppost. And incidentally, that black car has huge significance. So yeah, I hope I've given you enough of the suspense hook there to make you want to read on and see how this all plays out. But the genre is psychological suspense. It's a psychological thriller with a police investigation in it. I used to read a lot of thrillers, gangland thrillers, crime thrillers. But the one book that actually really got me into this genre was a book by Claire Mackintosh. Anyone read any books by Claire Mackintosh? Yes, my sister, I think you lent it to me actually. It's I Let You Go, and also the next book is called I See You, and oh my God, the fear that resonates through this story, it's just so realistic. And it starts with a woman being stalked on the London Underground. But I'd really recommend you read it, because it's absolutely brilliant. So, yeah, I love the psychological genre, and I wanted to write one myself. But writing a psychological thriller is very different from writing an action thriller. I mean, there's less action and violence, but there's a lot more thinking and analysing, and you do have to tap right into your characters' emotions. You have to get inside people's heads. Going by the books that I've read, they're also slower paced. You have to drip feed the suspense in very slowly, because if you reveal too much too early, you kill the suspense stone dead, and nobody wants to keep turning the pages. So, yeah, I had a slightly jolty start for this very reason. I was trying to sort of tell the story too fast, and it was losing its suspense, its impact. So it took me several attempts to actually get this story right. And another problem I had was depicting the characters. They were very complex. But, you know, I did my research. I spoke to people who'd worked in fostering, people who had fostered, and I spoke to a couple of police inspectors, one of whom worked at the Met on similar cases to the one I was writing about. Then in September 2019, I mentioned my book to my author friend here, Dan Jones. Now, Dan worked in children's homes, so I was actually really intrigued to hear a little bit about his experiences. And yeah, he told some shocking stories. And it really helped me to depict the hostile environment that is inside Mortimer's care homes. But later on, Dan told me about his friend Graham. Now, Graham grew up in care. Graham had some fascinating stories to tell, which included drink, drugs, and homelessness. So my sort of reaction to that was, oh wow, I've got to meet this guy. He sounds so much like my character Joe. So Dan introduced us. And I had an interview with Graham in the Waverley pub that same month. The insights Graham gave me into being in care were so inspirational. I was pretty upset when Dan told me he'd passed away, because I'd included him in the credits, and I never really got a chance to properly thank him for all the help he gave me. And, you know, I really would have liked to have told him how much he inspired this book. But as I say, if there's anything positive to come out of this tragic story, it's raising awareness of mental health issues and encouraging people to be more understanding. I dedicated this book to Graham, and I'm not going to tell you about the interview, because what I did instead was I included the best parts of that book, that chat. I included the best part of Graham's story in this tribute right at the end. So that will give you a much better idea of the type of conversation we had and you know, how interesting it was. So I'm going to raise a glass to Graham. Level. He may not be here in body, but I do feel he's here in spirit. And Maisie's parts are all written in first person. Every other character is in third person. I actually found it helped because, again, Maisie, she's quite a complex person. I wrote both characters in third person to start with, and like I say, I just wasn't liking the bits with Maisie. They just didn't work for some reason. And then when I started writing in first person, it just helped to get inside her head, into her thoughts, into her experiences and her memories and her therapy sessions. So yeah, I found that very easy, and it really worked for this book. It is, and the other problem is, of course, is there is a cycle of abuse. I mean, Graham told me about one child who'd been repeatedly abused all his life, and because it happened so often, it almost became a pattern of normality. Yeah. And this child actually ended up being the abuser. Yeah. And I just can't help thinking that the only way you can break that cycle is for more victims to come forward. I mean, this is what the police officer said. He said, if anything, you know, please try and push that point across that more victims need to come forward. Yeah. You know, there are fantasies out there, but there are some genuine cases that need investigation, and if the perpetrators are brought to justice, it's not going to undo what was done, but it can give that victim almost a form of closure. I think, you know, more understanding the society we are, the better it is. Because again, this type of abuse, it causes horrific mental health problems. I mean, you know, if you're abused as a child, you're going to be a very damaged adult. And you hear of people who gravitate towards crime and drugs, and a lot of these kids end up in prison. A lot of girls end up as prostitutes, and you know, it really does sort of warp this sort of sense of normality. And yeah, I'm a very strong believer, and I think you're right. Dan does sort of work Dan does is amazing. And Graham said the same thing. You know, he said that, you know, he had kids who were going out and getting absolutely wasted and coming back in the early hours. And the children's home, they used to lock the doors, but he used to let them in because he understood them. He knew that a lot of these kids did come from broken homes. And because they had no sort of solid parent who they could call up, they were vulnerable. So yeah, I think he understood only too well. So yes, thanks for that.
How did you find the police?
Police, very, very helpful indeed.
Were they helpful then, or were they more helpful now?
Well, they were certainly very helpful when I spoke to them about this book, because again, things have changed a lot in the police force. I mean, a lot of the police say, oh, you know, in my day, this, and that. But the two I spoke to, they were both retired, senior. One of them was a detective inspector with the Metropolitan Police. And he sort of wanted, you know, he said, I don't want you to sensationalise this sort of thing. You're not going to do that, are you? I said, no, I'm not going to do that. But, you know, I'd be very interested to know sort of how you handle these types of cases. For example, what if someone's accused? How do you go about that? And he told me things about home searches, for example, the type of clues that they look for. And he also told me about, you know, when you do get victims of abuse in, you really do need to treat them with sensitivity. You know, you can't accuse them of being liars, or, you know, they're carrying this awful shame, and, you know, you don't want to say anything that's going to make them feel even worse. So that was very helpful. And the other police officer, he's actually the husband of a friend of mine. She's another author. She used to be in Chindi, Marion Keel, and her husband was ops controller with Sussex Police for about 30 years. And he was an absolute mine of information when it came to procedures. And, you know, like as an operation manager, obviously he would tell me about things like, in a particular scene, he was telling me about how it would be handled, how, you know, there would be distance surveillance would be put in place. They wouldn't necessarily have armed police. And yeah, we just chatted on the phone for about an hour, and I just said, this is great, you know, thanks so much, because just talking to you for an hour, that's actually helped me write that final scene in the book. And it's set in Bognor, it's only set in Bognor, but there are scenes in Chichester, Goodwood, and there's also quite a lot of the story set in East Lavant. So that sort of covers quite a lot of the West Sussex area. I mean, a lot of the abuse that has been exposed did happen in the 90s. And again, you know, like again with Jimmy Savile, I hate to say this, I hate to keep referring to that revolting man, but there was a time, I mean, nowadays, if you were abused by Jimmy Savile, you would be called one of Jimmy Savile's victims. But 30 years ago, you would have been called one of Jimmy Savile's accusers. And that's the difference between then and now. At least children are listened to a lot more. I mean, I was finishing off my series, my thriller series, when I got the first idea in 2015. I finished that series in 2017, but I didn't actually start writing this till 2019, and it was released this year, 2021. So yeah, 2 years. I did about 3 complete rewrites, and then once I think last year really helped. I mean, I know it sounds awful, but we were in lockdown, and it was only when I spoke to the police officers that I started to realise I really need to get the investigation right in this story. And sure enough, this is where I kept stopping. I would get so far with it, and I'd think, oh God, you know, what now? And then I'd sort of introduce a character, say, let's just jump to this next scene, I'll introduce this character next. And eventually I had to go back and rewrite all these police scenes. And that's really got the ball rolling. And then from about April 2020 to September, I was just like writing away, and I got the first draft done. And it was like, thank goodness, you know, I never thought I was going to finish it at one point. So yeah, long work, but very, very pleased. And it's been professionally edited. I did also get offered a publishing deal. I did. But unfortunately, the sting in the tail to that was they wanted to, they said to me, can you pull it from Amazon before we send the contract out? And I thought, no, Because, you know, I've got a book launch coming up, I've got a radio interview coming up, I'm going to be in the paper. I mean, Dan's really helped a lot towards PR. And I thought, you know, that's, for example, tonight I could be stood here talking to you. You go and look for the book on Amazon, it wouldn't be there. So it was a very painful decision, but I had to turn that down. But it did give the book some sort of commercial. It sort of proved to me it had commercial appeal, so I was very happy with that. But otherwise, it's self-published. It's such a controversial subject. You really need to get the facts right. And talking to professionals, such as people in West Sussex County Council, I went along to one of their fostering information evenings, which was very interesting. And there's a lady in the park who we used to know when we used to walk our dog, and she fostered a teenage girl, and she told me about that experience, and I thought it wasn't a happy story. But yeah, it was all very interesting. And yeah, the police, the legal stuff, the children's homes, the story of the boy Graham growing up in care, it all really, really helped to add authenticity to this novel.
Have you got ideas for another book? Not yet.
Well, actually I have, I'll tell you about that in a minute. And, I think when you get to know your characters, you end their story and then you think, what now? Because I don't think Maisie and Joe will be back in any other books I write. You know, that's their story finished.
You rounded everything up beautifully, but I didn't find I missed the characters. I felt like I got to know them and fallen in love with them a little bit.
Oh. Yeah, I must admit, I got very close to them as well. They felt like friends. And with regards to a follow-up, I have actually got an idea. But it's not, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to bring Maisie and Joe back because I think their story's done and dusted now. But there is another character in this book. He's a boy who has Asperger's. And there's also another figure right at the very end. I'm not going to say too much, but I just feel there's more. There could be another story in this. So, but I'll think about it. I mean, this really was quite emotional and draining. So I don't know if I'm in any hurry to write a book just yet. I'm sure I will. There's not a lot of romance in this book. There is romance, but it's very sort of sketchy because, I mean, there's no graphic scenes of sex in it or abuse. I'd say probably the language is probably the most
I read the book,
controversial.
You know, I noticed. I felt there was a sympathetic attitude more to Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And you recommend that in the first person.
I liked Joe because, again, Joe was such a sort of hard streetwise character, but he was also very kind. You know, he had a lot of compassion, and that's, you know, the way I created him. I mean, he's not stunningly good looking. He's got a broken nose and a chipped tooth, and you know, he's got quite a lot of sort of uneven features, but there is something sort of very appealing about him. Yeah, and also I must admit I did like Maisie as well. I grew to sort of love her a bit like a daughter. You know, I felt protective of her when I was writing it, or say maybe a younger sister. So, thanks very much everyone for turning up. And
How much is the book?
I'm rather hoping some of you will buy a signed copy. It is £8. Now that's the same price as it is on Amazon. So yeah, but if you buy it from Amazon, you won't necessarily get a signed copy. So.